You won't believe what happened the very first weekend I moved into my lake cabin because it was something straight out of a drama movie. I had barely finished unpacking my boxes, still surrounded by tools, clothes, and half-assembled furniture when I heard the loudest, most aggressive knocking on my front door. At first, I thought maybe it was a friendly neighbor coming to welcome me to the area, maybe someone dropping off a pie or offering a helping hand. But when I opened the door, I was greeted by the exact opposite. Standing there on my porch was a woman who looked like she had practiced her angry stance in the mirror before arriving. She had oversized sunglasses covering half her face, a clipboard tucked under one arm, and her hands planted firmly on her hips like she was about to scold me for existing. She didn't smile, she didn't introduce herself, she just stared me down with the kind of look that makes you feel like you've just committed a crime. And then, in the most entitled voice I've ever heard, she snapped, "This cabin belongs to the HOA weekend rotation. It's my weekend here. You need to pack up and leave by tonight." For a moment I actually thought she was joking. I even laughed nervously because what kind of stranger marches up to someone's house and demands it like she's checking into a hotel? But her expression didn't change. She wasn't kidding. She fully believed this cabin, which I had just bought and signed papers for, was hers for the weekend. I blinked at her, completely stunned, and said, "Excuse me? This is my property. I bought this cabin 2 weeks ago. I think you have the wrong address." She smirked, tilting her head like she was dealing with a child. "No one buys property here without HOA approval," she said sharply. "We've always had a rotation system for weekend use, and this one is mine. If you're not willing to share, we'll deal with this the hard way." Now, keep in mind, I had never in my life joined an HOA. When I bought the cabin, the paperwork clearly showed that this plot of land was exempt from HOA rules. That was actually one of the main reasons I chose this place. I wanted peace, freedom, and no overbearing association breathing down my neck. But here I was, face to face with a woman who not only thought she controlled my cabin but also thought she had the authority to order me out of it. Trying to stay calm, I explained, "Look, ma'am, I have the deed and title right here. This cabin is legally mine, and I'm not leaving. I don't know what arrangement you think you have, but it doesn't apply to me." The second those words left my mouth, her face twisted like I had just insulted her entire family tree. She took off her sunglasses slowly, revealing the most exaggerated glare I've ever seen. "Oh, so you're going to be one of those," she hissed. "You think you can just stroll in here and ignore decades of rules? You think the HOA is going to let you disrespect us?" At this point I realized she wasn't just a nosy neighbor. She was the infamous HOA Karen I had already been warned about by the realtor. He had mentioned her in passing, saying, "Don't worry, you're not under the HOA, but there's a lady down there who sometimes tries to act like everyone is." I thought he was exaggerating. He wasn't. Karen crossed her arms and leaned in close, practically invading my personal space. "I'll give you one chance," she said through clenched teeth. "Pack your things, leave tonight, and we'll forget this ever happened." I almost burst out laughing because the audacity was unreal. I responded firmly, "This is my cabin. I'm not leaving. End of discussion." For a second, her jaw dropped like she couldn't believe anyone dared to stand up to her. Then she pointed her finger right in my face and barked, "You'll regret this. Nobody says no to the HOA. Nobody." With that, she spun around on her heels and stomped off my porch like a cartoon villain. I stood there for a moment, stunned, wondering if that really just happened. I looked around at the quiet lake, the tall pines swaying in the breeze, and shook my head in disbelief. I had expected my first weekend in the cabin to be peaceful, maybe a little lonely, maybe filled with chores like setting up the fishing gear or arranging my bookshelves. Instead, it had turned into some bizarre showdown with a stranger who believed my property was her vacation timeshare. As I shut the door and locked it, I thought, okay, maybe she'll cool off and realize she made a mistake. Maybe she'll come back tomorrow and apologize for confusing my cabin with someone else's. But deep down, I had this sinking feeling that this wasn't the end. Her last words echoed in my head like a threat: nobody says no to the HOA. I didn't know it yet, but that was the beginning of a storm that was about to test every ounce of my patience and sanity. Over the next few days, I started to realize that Karen wasn't just a loudmouth who had shown up once and embarrassed herself on my porch. No, she was committed to her delusion that my cabin was somehow hers to control, and every single day she seemed to find a new way to escalate the situation. It started with small things that were annoying but not exactly illegal. I would catch her walking slowly around my property, circling like a hawk, clipboard in hand, jotting down notes like she was a building inspector. The first time I spotted her peeking through my windows, I marched outside and demanded to know what she thought she was doing. She didn't even flinch. With a smug little smile, she said, "I'm conducting an HOA inspection. You'll be receiving a violation letter soon." That was the moment I laughed in her face because the absurdity was too much to handle. I told her as plainly as I could, "This property is not under the HOA. You have no authority here. Whatever violation letter you're writing will go straight into the trash." But Karen didn't care about reality, she cared about control. Soon after, she started spreading rumors to the neighbors. I'd overhear her on the sidewalk telling people, "That new guy. He's squatting in my cabin. He tricked the bank somehow, and now he's trying to steal what belongs to us." It was infuriating because I had spent my entire savings on this place, going through every background check, every financial hurdle, every legal process just to call it mine. To hear her brazenly telling others that I was a fraud boiled my blood. Some neighbors gave me wary looks at first, but thankfully most of them weren't buying her story. Still, the whispers created tension, and I could feel eyes on me every time I walked to my truck or carried groceries inside. Things escalated when she actually tried to enter my cabin one evening. I had just settled in to watch a movie when I heard the sound of metal scraping against the lock. My heart raced as I rushed to the door, flung it open, and there she was, hunched over, fumbling with a shiny key she had pulled from her purse. She didn't even look guilty. She straightened up, held the key proudly, and said, "The HOA keeps a master key for emergencies. You'll understand once you stop resisting." I couldn't believe her audacity. "That's not an emergency," I snapped. "And you do not have any legal right to enter my home. If you try this again, I'll call the police." Her smile vanished, and for the first time, I saw a flash of genuine anger in her eyes. She stepped closer, lowering her voice to a threatening whisper. "You think you can outlast me? You think the law is on your side? You don't know who you're dealing with. We always get our way." I slammed the door in her face and locked every bolt I had, but I couldn't shake the chill that ran down my spine. This woman wasn't going to stop. She thrived on conflict, and I had just become her favorite target. For the next few days, her tactics grew more aggressive. She started leaving notes taped to my door, each one more hostile than the last. One read, "You are in violation of HOA residency rules. Vacate immediately." Another note claimed, "Failure to comply will result in fines of $500 a day." I crumpled each note and tossed them in the trash, but the messages made it clear, she was determined to bully me into leaving. When the intimidation didn't work, she tried shaming me publicly. I came home one afternoon to find her standing at the edge of my driveway with two other HOA board members. They were blocking the path, arms crossed, glaring at me like some kind of jury. Karen declared, "We've all voted. You're out. We'll have security remove you if necessary." I raised my eyebrows and calmly said, "Go ahead and try. You'll find out real fast that this cabin isn't under your jurisdiction. You people don't own me, and you don't own this property." The two board members shifted uncomfortably, clearly less confident than Karen, but they stayed silent as she unleashed another rant about how I was poisoning the community spirit and refusing to cooperate with traditions. That word, traditions, stuck with me. What kind of tradition was it to claim other people's property for yourself? This wasn't a community tradition, it was Karen's power trip, plain and simple. That night, I sat on my porch staring at the lake, trying to figure out my next move. Part of me wanted to ignore her, to let her burn herself out with her nonsense. But another part of me knew people like Karen don't just stop. They push until they either get what they want or face consequences. And judging by her growing desperation, she was ready to push harder than ever. Sure enough, the very next morning she stormed back to my cabin, red-faced and shaking with rage. She didn't knock this time. She pounded on the door with both fists like she was trying to break it down. When I opened it, she practically screamed, "This is your final chance. Hand over the cabin for the weekend or else." I stood tall, looked her dead in the eye, and said, "Or else what?" That question set her off like a bomb. She jabbed her finger in my face, spit flying from her mouth as she shouted, "Or else the HOA will destroy you. You have no idea what's coming if you don't listen." It was the clearest sign yet that she wasn't just bluffing. She was gearing up for something bigger, something more dramatic. I could see it in her eyes. She was planning to make a move that would go far beyond nasty notes or fake violation letters. When she finally stormed off my porch, stomping like a furious child denied a toy, I knew the peace I had dreamed of when I bought this cabin was gone. Instead, I was now living in the middle of a battle zone created by a woman who couldn't accept the word no. What I didn't realize then was just how far she was willing to go to prove her point. Because the very next step in her plan would involve dragging the police into our fight and unleashing one of the wildest meltdowns I'd ever seen in my life. It happened on a Saturday morning when I least expected it. The sun was shining over the lake, the water calm, and I was sitting on my porch with a fresh cup of coffee, finally feeling like maybe things were settling down. For once, I allowed myself to believe Karen had given up, that she had embarrassed herself enough times already and decided to leave me alone. But I should have known better. Peace never lasts long when someone like her is involved. I spotted her in the distance, marching toward my cabin with two other people trailing behind her like backup dancers in some strange performance. Both of them were holding clipboards and looking nervous, but Karen was walking fast, chin up, eyes locked on me like a predator. I set my coffee cup down slowly, bracing myself, because I knew whatever was about to happen wasn't going to be pleasant. Before she even reached my porch, Karen started yelling. "This is the final warning," she screamed loud enough for the whole lake to hear. "Pack your things and leave. I've already scheduled my family's weekend here. You are trespassing and this nonsense ends today." The two board members shifted uncomfortably behind her, clearly regretting their decision to tag along, but they didn't say a word. I stood up calmly, leaned against the porch railing, and replied with as much patience as I could manage. "Karen, this is my cabin. I bought it. I own it. You and your so-called board don't have the slightest bit of authority over me, and I'm not leaving. Not now, not ever." Her face twisted into pure rage. She clenched her fists, stomped up the steps of my porch, and got right in my face. "You think you can ignore us? You think the HOA won't put you in your place?" she hissed. "You're going to regret every word you've just said." Then she did something I hadn't expected at all. She whipped out her phone, turned her back dramatically as if on stage, and dialed 911 right there in front of me. My jaw nearly dropped as I heard her voice transform into this fake, panicked, sobbing act. "Hello, police? There's a dangerous man trespassing on my property. He's refusing to leave. I feel unsafe. Please send officers immediately." The performance was so over the top I almost laughed. She was fake crying, raising her voice like she was being attacked, even glancing back at me while pointing as if I was lunging at her when in reality I was just standing there with my arms crossed, shaking my head in disbelief. One of the board members actually muttered under his breath, "Karen, maybe this isn't a good idea," but she snapped at him to shut up and continued with her frantic story. Yes, he's aggressive, he's refusing to vacate. Hurry, please, she wailed before hanging up dramatically and glaring at me with triumph in her eyes. I just smiled at her and said calmly, well, I hope you're ready for what happens when the truth comes out. That wiped the smug look off her face for a moment, but she quickly recovered and sneered. Oh, the police always listen to us. You don't stand a chance. She actually sat herself down on my porch chair as if she already owned the place, crossing her legs and adjusting her sunglasses while waiting for her so-called rescue. It was surreal. The two board members stood awkwardly to the side, one whispering to the other that this was getting out of hand. 15 minutes later, the sound of sirens broke the silence, and a sheriff's cruiser pulled up near the cabin. Karen jumped out of the chair like a kid on Christmas morning, waving her arms dramatically, running toward the deputies as if she was finally being saved. That's him, she screamed, pointing at me. That's the squatter. Arrest him now before he hurts someone. The deputies looked at her, then at me, clearly confused. They approached calmly, while Karen hovered behind them, shouting, "Don't believe a word he says. He forged papers. He's a fraud." One deputy held up his hand to quiet her, then turned to me. "Sir, can we see some identification and proof of ownership?" Without missing a beat, I pulled out my wallet and the folder I had prepared for exactly this moment. My ID, the property deed, closing documents, it was all there. I handed it over without saying a word. The deputy flipped through the papers, nodded, and said, "Everything checks out. This man is the legal owner." Karen's face turned bright red. She stormed up, shouting, "No. That can't be right. You don't understand, I'm on the HOA board, I control this property." The second deputy turned to her, stern and serious. "Ma'am, the HOA has no legal authority over properties not included in their agreements, and according to these documents, this cabin is not under your jurisdiction. You have no right to demand access here." Karen was shaking, her hands balled into fists, her voice cracking as she yelled, "You're lying. You're all in on it with him. This is a conspiracy." She started pacing, ranting about how she had been protecting the community for years, how everyone had to follow her rules, how I was ruining everything. The deputies exchanged looks, clearly fed up with her nonsense. One of them stepped closer and said firmly, "Ma'am, this is your last warning. If you continue to harass this property owner or file false reports, you could be arrested for misuse of emergency services and harassment." But Karen didn't stop. She threw her arms up, tears streaming down her face as she wailed, "This is unfair. I'm being punished for trying to protect what's mine." Her meltdown was so loud that a few neighbors came out of their homes to watch. They stood on the sidewalk, whispering to each other, shaking their heads. They were seeing firsthand the side of Karen many had only heard rumors about. Finally, the deputies had enough. "Ma'am, leave this property now," one officer ordered. "We won't say it again." Karen glared at me with pure hatred, her chest heaving, her face twisted into something almost unrecognizable. Then, with one last scream of, "This isn't over," she stormed off, dragging the two board members with her. They looked utterly humiliated, unable to meet my eyes as they followed her retreat. The police handed my documents back, apologized for the inconvenience, and reassured me that if she tried this again, I should call them directly. As the cruiser drove away, I sat back on my porch, finally able to breathe again. But even then, deep down, I knew this wasn't the end. Karen had just been publicly humiliated in front of the police and the neighbors. And people like her don't just crawl away quietly. They come back louder, angrier, and even more determined to prove they're right, no matter how wrong they are. What I didn't know was that the aftermath of this meltdown would end up shaking the entire neighborhood and changing Karen's reign of power forever. The moment the deputies pulled away from my driveway, I thought maybe, just maybe, things would finally calm down. Karen had been caught red-handed lying to the police, neighbors had seen her meltdown with their own eyes, and the officers had given her a crystal-clear warning. But if there's one thing I should have learned by then, it's that Karen was not the kind of person to back off gracefully. She thrived on conflict, and humiliation only fueled her obsession. For the first 2 days after the police incident, things were eerily quiet. I didn't see her pacing outside, I didn't find notes taped to my door, and no one knocked pretending to be from the HOA inspection team. I allowed myself to breathe again. I even sat out on the porch late one evening with a fishing rod, feeling for the first time like the lake was truly mine to enjoy. But peace is temporary when your neighbor is someone who cannot accept defeat. On the 3rd day after the police visit, the storm returned. I woke up to the sound of angry voices outside my window. When I pulled back the curtain, I saw Karen standing in the middle of my driveway waving papers in the air like she had discovered the smoking gun in a courtroom drama. With her were 3 HOA board members this time, not just 2, all of them looking nervous but clearly roped into her plan. "I have proof," she shouted as I stepped outside. "These documents show that you have no right to be here. This cabin was meant for the HOA's use, and you tricked your way into it." She shoved the papers at me, but when I took a closer look, they weren't legal documents at all. They were old meeting minutes and some handwritten notes about tradition of shared use. Nothing about ownership, nothing binding, just Karen's desperate attempt to fabricate authority. I handed them back and said firmly, "Karen, this means nothing. My deed is clear. Your HOA has no control here." That only pushed her over the edge. She stomped her foot like a child, screaming, "The deputies didn't believe me because I didn't have this. Now you'll see what happens when I take this to the sheriff himself." She turned to the board members, demanding they back her up. One of them finally spoke up, voice low and hesitant, "Karen, maybe we should let this go. He's right. The paperwork doesn't include his property." She spun on him with fire in her eyes. "Traitor," she snapped. "You're supposed to support the HOA, not some outsider squatter." The others shifted uncomfortably, clearly regretting being dragged along. Over the next week her harassment only grew. She parked her car at the edge of my property with the headlights facing my cabin, leaving it there for hours like some kind of intimidation tactic. She left flyers under my windshield wipers claiming I owed the HOA thousands of dollars in fines. She even called a tow truck one afternoon, trying to have my vehicle removed from my own driveway. Luckily the tow driver asked to see paperwork, and when I showed him my deed and explained the situation, he shook his head, muttered something about crazy HOA people, and left without touching my truck. Each failed attempt only made Karen angrier. Then came the night that proved she had completely lost control. I was asleep when pounding on my door jolted me awake at nearly midnight. Grabbing a flashlight, I opened it cautiously only to find Karen again, wild-eyed, hair messy, holding her phone like a weapon. "You're still here," she growled. "Fine. This time you're going to jail for real." Before I could even respond she dialed 911 again, shouting into the phone, "The squatter has threatened me. He's armed. Send backup immediately." My jaw dropped. I wasn't armed, I hadn't even stepped off the porch, and here she was fabricating an emergency that could have put me in serious danger. I realized in that moment just how reckless she was willing to be just to win. When the deputies arrived for the second time that week, they weren't amused. Karen ran toward them sobbing dramatically, but this time they weren't buying it. They separated us, asked me calmly to show documents again, which I did without hesitation, then turned their full attention to her. I could hear one deputy say firmly, "Ma'am, we warned you. Filing false emergency calls is a serious offense. You put lives at risk tonight." Karen tried to protest, her voice rising higher and higher until she was practically shrieking at them, calling them incompetent, accusing them of favoritism, even claiming I had bribed them. The neighbors had gathered again, standing on their porches, some even recording the scene with their phones. Everyone could see now who the real problem was. Finally, one of the deputies pulled out a notepad and began writing. Karen's face fell. "What are you doing?" she demanded. "I'm the victim here." The deputy didn't even flinch. "No ma'am, you are not the victim. You've wasted police resources twice, harassed your neighbor repeatedly, and tonight you made a dangerous false report. You're lucky we don't take you in right now." He handed her a citation, his voice cold and final. "If we get one more call like this, you will be arrested." Karen's meltdown in that moment was unforgettable. She tore the citation in half, threw the pieces in the air like confetti, and screamed at the top of her lungs. "This community is mine. You can't take it from me. You'll all regret this." The deputies calmly told her to leave, and when she refused, they escorted her off my property, walking her down the street like a stubborn child being dragged to timeout. The neighbors who had gathered began whispering and shaking their heads, some even laughing at how ridiculous she looked. For the first time I could see that her iron grip on the HOA was cracking. People weren't afraid of her anymore, they were embarrassed by her. When the police finally left, one of my neighbors, an older gentleman who had lived by the lake for decades, walked over and said quietly, "Son, you just did what none of us ever had the guts to do. You stood up to her, and now everyone sees the truth." That stuck with me because it made me realize this wasn't just about me and my cabin anymore. Karen had been controlling people here for years through fear and intimidation, and by refusing to bow down I had accidentally lit a fire under the entire community. The tide was turning, and Karen didn't even realize how quickly she was losing the very power she fought so hard to keep. That night, as I locked up and finally went back to bed, I lay awake thinking about everything that had happened. I had bought this cabin to escape stress, but instead I had found myself in the middle of a war with the self-appointed queen of the HOA. Still, as exhausting as it was, I knew one thing with absolute certainty. Karen's reign of terror was coming to an end, and the very meltdown she staged to try to destroy me was about to destroy her instead. After that night when Karen tore up her citation and was escorted off my property by the deputies, I thought I had finally seen the peak of her meltdown, but what came next was even more surprising, not because of what she did, but because of how the entire neighborhood responded. Word spread faster than wildfire around the lake community. By the next morning, everyone knew that Karen had called the cops twice on me, had been proven wrong both times, and had thrown such a tantrum that she nearly got herself arrested. For years she had ruled over the HOA like a dictator, barking orders, making up rules, fining people for things as small as leaving a kayak on the wrong dock, and now everyone was suddenly seeing her exposed, powerless, and ridiculous. When I went into town that day for groceries, 2 different neighbors stopped me in the parking lot to say, "We saw what happened last night. You handled yourself perfectly," and another even said, "You did us all a favor by standing up to her." It was clear the tide had turned. Back at the cabin, I noticed little changes in the days that followed. Neighbors who had once avoided eye contact with me started waving as they passed by in their boats. A couple even brought over baked goods as a gesture of solidarity, and one man invited me to join a weekend fishing trip. It was like the community had silently voted to pick a side, and the side they picked was mine. Meanwhile, Karen was nowhere to be seen. For almost a week, she vanished completely. No car parked at the end of my driveway, no flyers on my truck, no clipboard inspections around my property. It was eerie but also refreshing, like the neighborhood was finally breathing again without her constant shadow looming over it. But I knew her silence wouldn't last forever, and sure enough, she came back, but this time she didn't come screaming at me. Instead, she marched into an HOA board meeting determined to reassert her authority. The problem for her was that the other board members had seen enough. Several of them had been with her during her stunts against me, and they were embarrassed to have been dragged along. Now, after the second police call and the public meltdown, they were done letting her dictate everything. From what I heard later through neighbors, that board meeting turned into a shouting match where Karen tried to rally support to punish me, but instead, the board members turned the tables and voted her out as president of the HOA. She didn't go quietly, of course. She screamed about betrayal, accused them all of being weak, and stormed out, but the damage was done. Her reign was officially over. The neighborhood looked different after that. Without Karen's constant interference, people seemed happier. Kids played outside more, neighbors actually talked to one another without fear of being reported, and small community get-togethers that Karen used to shut down suddenly flourished. As for me, I went from being the outsider who bought a cabin to being something of a local hero. People would stop me on walks just to say, "Thank you for standing up to her." We've all wanted to, but nobody ever had the guts. I didn't set out to be a hero, all I wanted was peace, but in the process of defending my own cabin, I had given others the courage to stop letting Karen control their lives. Karen, on the other hand, completely avoided me after that. Every time I spotted her car in town, she would turn the other way or pretend not to see me. She never set foot near my cabin again, and she definitely didn't try to claim it for her weekend anymore. From what I gathered, she tried a few times to start fights with other neighbors, but without the title of HOA president backing her, her threats carried no weight. People laughed in her face, and that was something she couldn't handle. Eventually, she stopped showing up at community events altogether. One quiet evening a month later, I sat on my porch again, coffee in hand, watching the sunset over the lake. It struck me how much had changed in such a short time. When I first bought the cabin, I imagined peaceful mornings, fishing trips, and barbecues by the water. Instead, I was thrown into a battle with the most entitled neighbor anyone could imagine. But in the end, not only did I keep my cabin, I also helped free an entire community from her grip. It was strange but satisfying. I didn't just win for myself, I won for everyone who had ever been bullied by her HOA nonsense. Sometimes I catch myself replaying that first day when she stood on my porch and demanded the cabin as if it was hers for the weekend. I think about how ridiculous it sounded then and how much more ridiculous it sounds now, after everything that followed. She truly believed she was untouchable, that she could call the police, wave around fake authority, and intimidate me into giving her what she wanted. But the truth is, entitlement always collapses when it collides with reality. She underestimated me, and more importantly, she underestimated the law. And that was her downfall. Now the lake is quiet the way it should be. Neighbors fish together, kids ride bikes without being scolded for breaking rules, and my porch has become a favorite spot for visitors to stop and chat. The other day one neighbor even said, "It feels like a weight has been lifted since she lost power." I couldn't agree more. As for Karen, I have no idea what her next move will be, but honestly, it doesn't matter anymore. She has no power here, no authority, and no credibility. Her meltdown didn't just backfire, it ended her reign. And every time I sit on my deck looking at the calm reflection of the lake, I smile, because I know one thing for sure, this cabin is mine, my peace is mine, and no HOA tyrant will ever take that away from me again.